Imagine trying to grow food in an oven, because that's basically what ancient Egyptian farmers were dealing with. No modern irrigation, no high-tech equipment, just brutal, relentless heat. So how did they pull it off? From using fish waste to floating gardens that never touched the ground, here are 20 ways Egyptians grew crops in 122-degree heat. Nile River flooding. Every year, like clockwork, the Nile River overflowed, turning the dry desert into fertile farmland. This event, known as the flood season, was the foundation of Egyptian agriculture. Without it, growing crops in scorching heat would have been impossible. But how exactly did the floods help farmers survive in such extreme conditions? During this season, the river covers the fields with water for weeks, soaking the soil. Once the floodwaters receded, they left behind a thick layer of black silt, rich in minerals, that made the land perfect for planting. Unlike farmers in other ancient civilizations, Egyptians didn't have to rely on rain or complex irrigation at first. Instead, they planted crops directly into the moist, nutrient-rich soil left by the flood. Barley, wheat and flax thrived without extra watering, giving Egypt an enormous agricultural advantage. But what happened when the flood didn't come as expected? Egyptian records describe years when the river barely rose, leaving the fields dry and useless. One particularly devastating drought struck during the reign of Pharaoh Djedkare Isesi, 5th dynasty. The low floods led to failed harvests, food shortages and desperation. Temples overflowed with prayers and offerings, but the waters never rose. On the other hand, too much flooding was just as dangerous. When the Nile swallowed entire villages, crops were destroyed instead of nourished. These unpredictable disasters forced Egyptians to find ways to control the flood's impact. To manage the floods, the Egyptians developed canals and reservoirs to store water for dry years. This system paved the way for basin irrigation. Basin irrigation. The Nile River's annual flood was a gift, but not every farmer could rely on luck alone. Some years, the water rushed in too fast, washing away soil, while in other years, it barely reached the fields. To take control, ancient Egyptians developed basin irrigation, a technique that trapped floodwater in enclosed fields, allowing it to soak into the land slowly and evenly. This method revolutionized farming in Egypt's extreme heat, ensuring crops got the right amount of water even when temperatures hit 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Farmers divided their land into basins using earthen walls called dikes. These basins varied in size, some covering hundreds of acres, depending on how much water was needed. When the Nile flooded, the water was guided into these basins through a system of small channels. Once the water filled the fields, farmers sealed off the channels with mud barriers, trapping the water inside. Over time, it seeped into the soil, keeping it moist long after the floodwaters receded. Basin irrigation wasn't just a farming technique, it was a matter of political power. Controlling water meant controlling Egypt's food supply. Pharaohs and royal officials organized massive labor forces to dig canals, build dikes, and maintain reservoirs. Records from the reign of Amenemhat III, Thutmosis the 12th dynasty, describe how his government oversaw massive irrigation projects to store floodwaters and prevent droughts. Some historians even believe that the famous Lake Moeris in the Fayum region was an artificial reservoir created for irrigation purposes. Unlike regular flooding, which drained away too quickly or pooled unpredictably, basin irrigation gave farmers complete control. They could decide when to release the water and which crops needed it most, ensuring they could grow barley, wheat, flax and vegetables even in the driest months. Shaduf water lifting. In a land where the Nile's water didn't always reach every field, Egyptian farmers needed a solution to lift water to their crops without breaking their backs in the searing heat. The answer was the shaduf, an invention so practical that it has been in use for over 3,000 years. By the time of Pharaoh Ramesses II, shadufs lined the banks of the Nile, operated by farmers working under the scorching sun. In cities like Elephantine and Hermopolis, where the terrain made traditional flood irrigation difficult, the shaduf kept entire villages fed. The shaduf was a wooden beam with a counterweight on one end and a bucket on the other, allowing farmers to pull up water from rivers, canals or wells with little effort, unlike large-scale irrigation projects controlled by pharaohs. The Shahduaf gave individual farmers the power to irrigate their land on their own terms. But this wasn't just a tool, it was a game changer for small communities. The Shahduaf was very simple. It didn't require animals, complex machinery or government control, just human hands and basic material. This made it an essential tool for villages far from major cities, where farmers needed to rely on themselves rather than royal irrigation projects. Even today, in rural parts of Egypt, some farmers still use the Shahduaf, proving that a well-designed tool never goes out of style. Sakia water wheel. While the Shahduaf was a farmer's best friend, it had one major limitation. It relied on human effort. This wasn't a problem for small fields, but as Egypt's population grew and larger farms emerged, something more powerful was needed. Here comes the Sakia water wheel, an invention that revolutionized Egyptian irrigation and allowed water to flow continuously. Unlike the Shahduaf, the Sakia was powered by animals, typically oxen or donkeys. The design was simple but effective. A large wooden wheel with clay pots attached. As the animal walked in a circle, the wheel turned, lifting water from the Nile or deep wells and emptying it into irrigation channels. This meant farmers could water their crops all day without stopping. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Sakia became widespread during the Ptolemaic period, 305 to 30 BC, but many historians believe it may have been used much earlier. In cities like Memphis and Thebes, massive agricultural estates, some owned by the pharaoh himself, relied on these wheels to support large-scale grain production. The more efficient the irrigation, the more food they could store, which helped Egypt maintain its dominance as a major grain supplier in the ancient world. The Sakia was so effective that variations of it spread beyond Egypt. Similar designs appeared in Persia, India, and even medieval Europe. While the original wooden models have long disappeared, some Egyptian farmers still use metal versions of the Sakia today. Canal networks. Water from the Nile's annual flood didn't always reach every farm. Some fields were too far from the river, while others needed more controlled irrigation. To solve this, ancient Egyptians built an extensive canal system, turning natural flooding into a year-round irrigation network. One of the earliest large-scale canal projects was built during the reign of Pharaoh Amenemhat III. His engineers expanded irrigation networks in the Fayum region, creating Lake Moeris, an enormous man-made reservoir that stored excess Nile water for use during dry seasons. This ensured that farmers had a reliable water supply, even when the river's flood was too weak. Egyptians dug artificial waterways to channel water deep into farmlands, ensuring crops had a steady supply even after the floodwaters receded. Some canals stretched miles from the Nile, allowing villages far from the riverbanks to farm successfully. This system was so effective that it lasted thousands of years, and even Greek and Roman rulers expanded on Egyptian canals. Deep ploughing techniques. Irrigation alone wasn't enough to grow crops in Egypt's relentless heat. If soil became too hard, water couldn't seep deep enough to sustain plant roots. That's why Egyptian farmers developed deep ploughing techniques, breaking up compacted earth to improve water absorption and soil fertility. Early Egyptian farmers relied on hand tools like hoes and digging sticks to break up the soil. But as farming expanded, they needed a more efficient method. By the time of the Old Kingdom, c. 2686 to 181 BCE, they began using ploughs pulled by oxen, allowing them to dig deeper furrows in less time. Deeper furrows meant water stayed in the soil longer, protecting crops from the intense sun. Farmers also mixed in animal manure and leftover plant material, creating natural fertilizers that helped crops grow faster and stronger. This technique became essential in areas like Middle Egypt, where farms relied on irrigation canals rather than direct flooding. Deep ploughing wasn't just used by small farmers, it played a role in Egypt's temple-run farming system. Large estates, often controlled by high priests and royal officials, had workers tilling the land to support temple food reserves. Inscriptions from Ramesses III's reign show ploughing scenes on temple walls, emphasising how crucial these methods were to Egypt's survival. Crop rotation and mixed planting. Growing crops in Egypt's scorching heat was only possible if the soil was fertile year after year. Without modern fertilisers, Egyptian farmers relied on crop rotation and mixed planting to keep their fields productive. Instead of planting the same crop every season, farmers rotated different crops to prevent the soil from wearing out. Cereal crops like wheat and barley were planted one season, and in the next, legumes like lentils and chickpeas replaced them. The legumes restored nitrogen in the soil, ensuring that future crops had enough nutrients to survive. Egyptians also used fallow fields, leaving some land empty for a season so it could regain fertility naturally. This was especially important in areas that weren't directly flooded by the Nile, where soil exhaustion happened more quickly. Egyptians also practiced mixed planting, growing different crops together in the same field. This method helped maximize space while improving soil health. For example, onions and leeks were planted alongside wheat and barley, since they required different nutrients and didn't compete for the same resources. This system was widely used in temple-run farms, where scribes recorded exact planting schedules to ensure a steady food supply. Some records from Pharaoh Seti III's reign suggest that major temples even had specialized fields for different crop cycles, showing just how advanced Egyptian farming strategies were. Manure and natural fertilizers. Without synthetic fertilizers, ancient Egyptians had to find creative natural ways to enrich their soil. Their solution: manure, compost, and organic waste, which helped keep their farmland fertile, even under the relentless 122 degrees Fahrenheit sun. Egyptians had plenty of options when it came to natural fertilizers. Animal manure from oxen, donkeys and goats. Mud and silt from the Nile's annual flood. Rotting plant material, including straw and vegetable scraps. Animal manure was the most valuable because it contained nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, essential for strong plant growth. Farmers would spread dried manure over their fields before planting, ensuring that the soil held onto moisture and nutrients for longer. Some scholars believe that wealthier landowners even assigned workers to collect and spread manure, turning it into an organised farming practice rather than just a random habit. Which controlled massive agricultural estates, kept records of how much manure was used on different fields. In records from Pharaoh Ramesses III's reign, temple officials mentioned distributing thousands of baskets of manure to ensure that temple-owned farmlands remained productive. Night irrigation. Egyptian farmers had to be strategic about when they watered their crops. With temperatures soaring during the day, watering at the wrong time meant rapid evaporation, wasting precious water before it even reached plant roots. The solution? Night irrigation, watering crops after sunset to ensure maximum absorption. Ancient Egyptian farming manuals, some found in temple archives from the reign of Seti I, mentioned labourers working at dusk to redirect water from irrigation canals into the fields. This ensured that barley, wheat and flax crops received adequate moisture without waste. Nighttime watering was especially useful in regions like Asyut and Amarna, where water shortages were common. During the scorching Egyptian afternoons, the sun's heat quickly dried out exposed soil. If farmers watered during the day, much of the moisture would vanish before it could soak in. By waiting until sunset, when temperatures dropped and humidity increased, water had time to penetrate deeper into the soil, keeping crops hydrated for longer. This method wasn't limited to individual farmers. Large temple estates and royal farmlands relied on nighttime irrigation to maintain high crop yields. Historical texts suggest that some overseers even scheduled labour shifts at night, making sure that fields were watered while the air was cool. The success of night irrigation made Egyptian agriculture more efficient. Granaries with cooling systems. Grain wasn't just food in ancient Egypt. It was currency, tribute, and survival. A single failed harvest could mean famine. So Egyptians developed granaries with cooling systems to store wheat and barley for months without spoilage, even in the blazing desert heat. Egyptian granaries were often beehive-shaped structures built with thick mud brick walls. This wasn't just for aesthetics. The shape and materials naturally insulated the interior, keeping stored grain cool and dry. The walls absorbed heat during the day, but released it slowly at night, preventing extreme temperature shifts inside. Granaries weren't just used by individual farmers. They were part of a larger food storage system managed by the state. Temple records from the reign of Pharaoh Rameses III mention massive granaries that stored grain for distribution across Egypt, especially during times of drought or poor harvests. Some granaries were built partially underground, using the Earth's cooler temperatures to protect against heat. These underground storage areas were particularly common in Lower Egypt, where the heat was more intense. Archaeological evidence from sites near Memphis and Saqqara shows multi-chambered granaries designed to separate different types of grain, preventing spoilage. These storage facilities ensured Egypt's agriculture-based economy remained stable. Farmers would deposit grain into state-run granaries as tax payments, while officials carefully monitored stock levels. Some of these structures still exist today, showing just how advanced Egyptian food storage techniques were. Underground water transport. Growing crops in Egypt's scorching heat wasn't just about irrigation. It was about keeping water from disappearing too far. In areas where open canals weren't enough, ancient Egyptians developed underground water transport systems to move and store water without it evaporating under the blazing sun. Instead of relying only on surface irrigation, Egyptians dug underground channels to direct water straight to their fields. This prevented evaporation losses and ensured that water reached deep into the soil before the sun could dry it out. These hidden canals linked wells, reservoirs, and flood basins, allowing farmers to grow barley, wheat, and vegetables in places where open canals would have been ineffective. While underground canals were mostly used by small farming villages, records from Pharaoh Amenemhat III's reign mention projects where water storage tunnels were built near royal agricultural estates. Some historians believe that these hidden irrigation networks helped expand Egypt's farming land, allowing crops to grow even in the driest seasons. Farmers who lived near these canals had an advantage, as their fields received more consistent water, reducing their dependence on unpredictable floods. With fewer losses due to evaporation, they could maintain higher crop yields, ensuring steady food production even in years when the Nile's flood levels were lower than expected. Dew collection. Even in the driest deserts, water was in the air. Literally, Egyptians knew that morning dew formed on rocks and plants overnight, and they found ways to harvest this moisture to keep their crops alive. This wasn't a main water source, but in areas far from the Nile, it was a survival strategy for small-scale farming. Farmers in desert regions like the Eastern Desert and Siwa Oasis noticed that rocks, clay pots, and leaves gathered small amounts of dew at night. They took advantage of this by placing large stones around their fields, which helped trap moisture. As the sun rose, these stones slowly released the collected water into the soil, giving crops like onions, leeks, and herbs extra hydration. Some records suggest that temple farmers designed gardens with dew collection in mind. Clay basins and porous storage jars captured condensation, preventing early morning moisture from going to waste. This gave crops in royal gardens and temple estates an added advantage, ensuring they stayed hydrated even in the worst droughts. This method was especially useful for smaller farms that couldn't rely on canal irrigation. Farmers in dry regions mixed dew collection with mulching techniques, covering soil with straw and leaves to trap moisture even longer. Even though this wasn't enough to water an entire field, it was a way to reduce reliance on scarce irrigation water. By combining dew collection with other methods, Egyptian farmers maximized every available drop of moisture. Those who mastered this technique were able to grow crops even in extreme conditions, where others struggled to keep their fields from drying out. It was a small but valuable addition to Egypt's already advanced water management systems. Floating gardens. With scorching 122 degrees, 50 degrees Earth, heat, and limited fertile land, Egyptian farmers had to think beyond traditional farming. One of the most innovative methods, floating gardens, small crop-covered rafts that floated on the Nile, allowing plants to grow directly over the water. These raft farms reduced the need for irrigation, making them an effective solution for growing crops without relying on unpredictable flood cycles. Floating gardens were particularly useful in regions with limited farmland, such as areas near Memphis and Elephantine, where riverbanks were narrow. These gardens allowed farmers to maximise space by extending their crops into the water itself. Vegetables, herbs and grains were commonly grown on these rafts, thriving in the humid environment. Egyptian farmers constructed floating gardens using bundles of reeds, papyrus and wooden frames. These rafts were layered with rich river silt, creating a natural planting bed where crops could take root. The gardens floated along the riverbanks, absorbing water directly from the Nile. This meant farmers didn't have to rely on rainfall or irrigation canals. The plants had constant access to moisture, even during Egypt's dry seasons. Some historians believe that wealthier landowners and temple estates used floating gardens to supplement their food supply, ensuring steady crop production year-round. However, this method was likely developed by small-scale farmers who needed creative solutions to grow food without relying solely on land irrigation. The concept of floating farms wasn't unique to Egypt. Similar methods were later used in Mesoamerican civilizations, but Egyptians were among the earliest innovators, proving that when farmland was scarce, they could turn the river itself into fertile ground. Buried water jars. Water was Egypt's most valuable resource, and in the relentless desert sun, every drop counted. To prevent evaporation and ensure crops received just the right amount of moisture, Egyptian farmers used a technique called olla irrigation, burying clay water jars near plant roots to provide slow, efficient hydration. Unlike massive canal projects controlled by the pharaohs, buried water jars were a small-scale, farmer-led innovation. Individual farmers, particularly in rural villages near Abydos and Thebes, used this technique to conserve water and extend their growing seasons. Since each olla could last for months before needing a refill, it allowed farmers to focus on tending their crops instead of constantly carrying water from wells or rivers. Farmers placed porous clay pots, known as ollas, into the soil and filled them with water. The pots acted as underground reservoirs, slowly releasing moisture directly into the surrounding earth as needed. This method ensured that plants like barley, wheat and legumes absorbed water efficiently without wasting a single drop. This low-maintenance but highly efficient system allowed Egyptian farmers to make the most of their limited water supply. Even in the face of extreme heat, they found ways to keep their crops hydrated and thriving. Desert sand mulching. Growing crops in Egypt's relentless heat was nearly impossible without efficient water conservation methods. One of the most effective techniques was desert sand mulching, a strategy that trapped moisture in the soil by covering it with a protective layer of sand. This prevented rapid evaporation and helped farmers grow crops in areas where water was scarce. Egyptian farmers spread a thin layer of fine desert sand over their fields, creating a natural barrier that slowed down moisture loss. This method allowed water to stay locked in the soil for longer, reducing the need for frequent irrigation. The sand also reflected sunlight, helping to keep the ground cooler and protecting delicate crop roots from overheating. This technique was especially useful in Upper Egypt, where the land was drier and Nile floodwaters didn't always reach farmlands. Farmers in regions like Abydos and Dendera used sand mulching to grow barley, wheat and flax, ensuring their fields remained fertile even in the harshest months. While small-scale farmers benefited the most from sand mulching, large estates and temple farms also adopted the practice. Ancient Egyptian texts from the reign of Pharaoh Amenhotep III mention efforts to improve agricultural productivity in desert areas. Some scholars believe that sand mulching was one of the methods used to extend Egypt's farmland beyond the Nile's immediate reach. This technique was so effective that variations of it continued to be used for centuries, influencing later agricultural practices in North Africa and the Middle East. Selective breeding. Egyptians didn't just rely on water conservation to sustain their crops. They also manipulated plants themselves. Through selective breeding, they developed stronger, drought-resistant crops that could survive in extreme conditions with minimal water. Selective breeding involved choosing the hardiest plants from each harvest and using them for the next planting season. Over generations, farmers strengthened their crops' resistance to heat and drought, creating stronger, more resilient plant varieties. Grains like barley and emmer wheat, which were staples in the Egyptian diet, were particularly adapted for dry conditions. Farmers in regions like Aswan and the Fayum Basin would save seeds from the most drought-tolerant plants, ensuring that each new generation of crops could survive with less water. Egyptians also experimented with flax and vegetables, selectively growing varieties that could withstand long periods without rain. This was crucial for farmers who lived far from the Nile or depended on unpredictable irrigation methods. While individual farmers played a major role in crop selection, Egypt's large temple estates and royal granaries had more structured breeding programs. Temples, which controlled vast agricultural lands, needed consistent food supplies to feed priests, workers, and officials. Pharaohs also relied on large-scale grain production to support the kingdom's economy. In times of weak Nile floods, drought-resistant crops became even more valuable. Some historians suggest that by the New Kingdom period, 1550 to 1070 BCE, Egyptian farmers had already developed grain varieties that needed significantly less water than earlier crops. Selective breeding helped Egypt maintain its status as the breadbasket of the ancient world. Their ability to adapt crops to extreme climates meant that even in years of drought, they could still produce enough food to sustain the population. By combining advanced irrigation, water conservation, and crop engineering, the Egyptians proved that even in the harshest deserts, agriculture could thrive. Moonlight-based farming. Egypt's relentless daytime heat made traditional farming methods a challenge. While irrigation helped, many crops still struggled under the intense desert sun, leading to stunted growth and rapid evaporation of moisture from the soil. To counteract this, some Egyptian farmers practiced moonlight-based farming, a method where crops were planted, watered, and even harvested at night, taking advantage of the cooler temperatures to protect delicate plants. Evidence from tomb paintings, temple inscriptions, and labour records suggests that workers in cities like Thebes, Elephantine, and Aswan were sometimes assigned night shifts for farm labour, ensuring that sensitive crops were tended to without the risk of heat stress. Some historians believe that the priests who managed temple farms may have used this method to grow sacred plants like papyrus and lotus flower, which were vital for religious ceremonies. Instead of exposing crops to scorching daytime temperatures, farmers would work their fields after sunset, when the heat had subsided. The night air kept the soil cooler, slowing down moisture loss and allowing plants more time to absorb water before the next day's heat. This method was particularly effective for leafy vegetables and herbs such as lettuce, onions, and dill, which wilted quickly under direct sunlight. While most farmers worked during the day, those who lived in desert-edge regions such as the Dakhla and Karga oases, had no choice but to adapt their schedules to maximise their water usage. Wealthier landowners and temple estates could afford to hire night labourers, ensuring that their most valuable crops were protected from the sun's harsh effect. This nighttime farming approach also helped conserve water. Since irrigation at night meant less evaporation, farmers used less water overall. In a civilization where every drop of water was sacred, moonlight farming became a simple but effective way to extend the growing season and increase crop yields despite the extreme desert climate, using fish waste as fertilizer. The Nile wasn't just Egypt's lifeline for water, it also provided a key source of natural fertilizer. Farmers discovered that discarded fish remains, including bones, scales, and organs, enriched their soil, leading to stronger, healthier crops. Without realizing it, they had developed one of the earliest forms of aquaponics, a farming system that used fish waste to boost plant growth. After catching fish from the Nile and its canals, Egyptians often threw the inedible parts into their fields, particularly during the flood season. Over time, they noticed that crops in these areas grew faster and stronger. The reason? Decomposing fish waste released nitrogen and phosphorus, two nutrients that improved soil fertility and made plants grow more robustly. This method was especially useful in years of weak Nile floods, when the annual silt deposits were too thin to fully fertilize the field. Farmers in Memphis, Abydos, and Fayum used fish remains to compensate for low nutrient soil, ensuring that their barley, wheat and vegetables still thrive. Small-scale farmers who fished in the Nile were among the first to notice the benefits of fish waste. Since fish was a common food source, this fertilizer was widely available and required no extra labour or cost. Over time, even larger estates and temple farms adopted the practice. Temple records from the reign of Pharaoh Seti I suggest that officials monitored soil conditions, which may indicate that organised fertilisation methods, including fish waste, were used in state-controlled grain production. Historians believe that this technique played a role in Egypt's agricultural success, allowing them to produce food even in harsh conditions. The concept of enriching soil with fish waste survived for centuries, influencing later civilizations in Greece, Rome, and beyond. Today, modern aquaponics systems operate on the same basic principle, proving that Egyptian ingenuity was centuries ahead of its time. Man-made shade towers. Egypt's unrelenting heat posed a major challenge for farmers. While irrigation helped, excessive sunlight still dried out the soil too quickly, leaving crops vulnerable to wilting. To combat this, Egyptians built man-made shade towers, large reed or palm structures designed to block direct sunlight and regulate temperatures over their field. Shade towers were especially useful in Upper Egypt, where the intensity of the sun made farming particularly difficult. In cities like Thebes and Abydos, farmers growing lettuce, onions and herbs found that shaded fields retained moisture longer, reducing the frequency of irrigation. The technique was also used in temple gardens, where priests cultivated medicinal plants and sacred flowers that needed controlled exposure to sunlight. These temporary structures were crafted from bundles of papyrus, reeds, or palm fronds, supported by wooden poles. Farmers positioned them strategically over their crops, allowing just enough sunlight for growth while preventing excessive heat damage. Unlike permanent shelters, these towers were lightweight and movable, meaning farmers could adjust them seasonally, depending on which areas of their fields needed the most protection. While small farmers built simple shade structures for personal plots, larger temple estates and royal farms adopted more advanced shading techniques. Records from Pharaoh Amenhotep III's reign suggest that shade structures were used in temple-owned agricultural lands, ensuring that even heat-sensitive crops could flourish year-round. Shade towers were a precursor to modern greenhouse shading techniques, and it influenced later Persian and Greek farming practices. Egyptians understood that controlling the microclimate of their fields was just as important as watering them properly. Wind-guided irrigation. Egyptians knew that water was scarce, but they also recognized that air carried moisture. By studying wind patterns, they found ways to trap humid air and redirect it toward their crops, reducing water loss and keeping their fields hydrated even in extreme heat. This method was particularly effective in Lower Egypt, where coastal winds carried cooler, more humid air inland. Farmers in cities like Bubastis and Tanis positioned their fields near wind-friendly zones, maximizing their exposure to natural cooling effects. This allowed them to grow grain and vegetable crops with less irrigation. Farmers built barriers made of reeds, mud brick or stone, placing them in strategic locations to alter wind direction. These structures slowed down hot desert winds while capturing the cooler, moisture-laden breezes from the Nile and the Mediterranean. The result? More humidity around crops, less evaporation, and extended moisture retention in the soil. Temple gardens and royal estates likely took advantage of this technique. The gardens of Karnak and Heliopolis, which housed fruit trees, sacred lotus flowers, and medicinal herbs, may have used wind barriers to protect delicate plants, while improving overall water efficiency. Some scholars believe that Egyptian engineers studied air movement much like they did water flow, using this knowledge to improve both crop yields and comfort within walled gardens. Wind-guided irrigation was a passive but powerful tool. Egyptians didn't need complex machinery, just a deep understanding of their environment. Their ability to control both water and air was a key factor in their agricultural success, allowing them to produce abundant harvests even in the harshest desert conditions.